Speaker.
Dr. Kennedy Graham.
Mr. Speaker, tēnā koutou e te whare. Kātu o mō ngā kakariki ki te kōrero I te pānuitanga, tuatahi o tēnei te piri Maritime's Crime Amendment. Mr. Speaker, this bill before us essentially goes back 30 years and a bit more. As has been noted before, essentially can be traced back to the terrorist event with the Akele Loro in 1985, but also a similar event, if we recall it, with regard to the Rainbow Warrior in Waitemata Harbour in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Those events, obviously, particularly Akele Loro, brought us to 1988 with the Rome Convention against the suppression of unlawful acts against the safety of maritime navigation and its immediate protocol, the suppression of unlawful acts against the safety of fixed platforms. It's worth remembering, Mr. Speaker, in those days, this House did not even have the nuanced constitutional maturity of a treaty examination. We just lumbered along. It took us, say, 11 years. 11 years, from 1988 to 1999, to bring in the Maritime Crimes Act. But we did. 1999. Within 2 years, we experienced the Twin Towers terrorist event in New York, which ushered in the age of global terrorism, which in turn ushered in, for better or worse, and it was for worse, the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. And I support the comments by the Honourable David Parker and others about the inanity and the lack of application of international law at the global level that allows that kind of thing to go with impunity. That, in turn, brought us to 2005 with these current protocols, maritime navigation and fixed platform, the 2005 protocols to the Rome Conventions. New Zealand signed those 2 years later in 2007. But it took us an exactly equal amount of time, 11 years, to get from those protocols to this day with this enabling legislation. The 2005 protocols that are essentially before us in the context of this legislation amend both the Rome Convention and the Rome Protocol to ensure that the maritime security framework established under the parent treaties can respond to temporary transnational threats. The bill enables New Zealand to ratify those 2005 protocols to introduce new offences related to maritime terrorism, illicit trafficking by ship of weapons of mass destruction, transportation of fugitives by ship, intentionally causing death in connection with those offences, and maritime boarding. Such was the state of alarm in New Zealand that it took us 11 years to get to the stage. It took 2 years to get to the stage of New Zealand signing, and another 2 years, so a total of 4 years, before our Foreign Affairs Committee undertook the treaty examination. The Foreign Affairs Committee reported back in July 2009 unanimously, which included the Green Party agreement, unanimously supporting continuing movement towards ratification of the 2005 protocols. That continuing movement has since experienced a pause of 7 years before resuming any discernible pace. But if we look at the Foreign Affairs Committee's report, we acknowledge that, as it says, and I think we would all agree, The overriding objective of the proposed treaty action would be to update and strengthen New Zealand's ability to deal with maritime security challenges by ensuring that an appropriate legislative framework is in place. There is no satisfactory non-legislative implementation option that has been identified. And essentially, the committee concluded implementation of the protocols would strengthen New Zealand's support for global counter-terrorism and non-proliferation efforts and help ensure that New Zealand's domestic maritime security framework is consistent with international best practice. The protocols have particular relevance, of course, to New Zealand as a coastal nation dependent on the security of its shipping routes. Of the 5 principal benefits of the protocol, 2 are worth explicitly identifying here, I think. It would help strengthen New Zealand's legal framework that underpin necessary maritime security, counter-terrorism and counter-proliferation action. And it would also be valuable in the context of New Zealand's support for the global initiative to combat nuclear terrorism and in bolstering New Zealand's ability to respond to some of those threats. So that's the assembled wisdom of the Foreign Affairs Committee in 2009, and the Green Party continues, as it did back then, to associate itself with it. We will support the bill, but we will support it into select committee and continue to monitor the progress of the bill. We do have our concerns around the designation of particular groups as terrorists. We do recognise that the 2005 protocols concern actual or attempted behaviour and do not address the classification of groups themselves. But if you look at some of the provisions, they could potentially cover the actions of direct action environmental groups and see such groups potentially regarded as, or alleged to be regarded as, terrorists. It could be regarded that some of those groups use or attempt to use ships to intentionally cause damage to other ships with the purpose of compelling a government or international organisation to do or to abstain from doing any act, to quote the legislation. But such actions are inherently violent and arguably not in line with the Green Party's principle of non-violence. So discretion does need to be exercised by governments about whether to charge such groups with terrorist offences or not. Overall, sir, the bill enables New Zealand to meet its obligations as an international citizen and is in line with our principle of non-violence, hence our support into Select Committee. But we will be monitoring that particular aspect of the legislation closely as we go in Select Committee. Let me just conclude, Mr. Speaker, by associating the Green Party with the comments of the Honourable David Parker in relation to the 2003 illegal invasion of Iraq and the inspired and positive leadership of the Honourable Helen Clark, Michael Cullen and Phil Goff in that respect. We pay tribute to all 3 of them and to Mr. Goff, who is sitting in the chamber today. A very fine, upstanding parliamentarian. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
I call